A 58-year-old retired teacher named Margaret survives a terrifying attempt on her life after her own daughter pushes her and her husband off a mountain cliff. If you want to know what happened next, continue watching the story of greed. Also, subscribe our channel to get more stories like this. Margaret Hale woke before the sun the way she always had, quietly and without alarm, as if her body had spent an entire lifetime learning the rhythm of ordinary mornings. The house still carried the cool softness of dawn. The floor beneath her slippers creaked in familiar places as she crossed the hallway toward the kitchen, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself while the first pale blue light pressed gently against the windows. Outside, the garden waited beneath a thin layer of mist. She could already hear the birds beginning their morning arguments among the hedges William had planted 20 years earlier. Somewhere farther down the lane, a milk truck rattled over uneven pavement. Everything felt safe, held together, known. Margaret filled the kettle and placed it on the stove, then stood for a moment with both hands resting on the counter, listening to the quiet breathing of the house around her. 35 years of marriage had given their home its own language. The click of William's heavier footsteps meant he was awake before he spoke. The soft cough from the hallway meant he had slept badly. The scrape of chair legs against tile meant he would complain about his knees, but refuse to sit down for long. She knew all of it without thinking anymore. "Morning, love," William said behind her. His voice still carried the rough warmth of sawdust and winter fireplaces even after retirement. Margaret smiled before turning around. "You're early." "So are you." "You say that every morning." "And every morning I'm right." He leaned down and kissed her forehead while reaching automatically for the mugs hanging beneath the cabinet. His hands were still broad and scarred from decades of carpentry. Margaret used to trace those pale scars with her fingertips when they were younger, asking where each one came from. Most of them involved stubborn wood and unnecessary confidence. William prepared tea exactly the same way every day. Strong for him, slightly weaker for her, 1 sugar each, milk after pouring, never before. Margaret watched him move through the kitchen with easy familiarity while the kettle hissed louder. She loved the small things most now, the things younger people never noticed because they believed love had to be dramatic to matter. The way William always warmed her cup first with hot water before making tea because he said it kept it tasting proper. The way he folded the newspaper corner she liked for crossword puzzles. The way he silently pushed the last biscuit on the plate toward her every evening while pretending he did not want it. 35 years. Thousands of invisible kindnesses. The kitchen filled with the smell of tea leaves and toasted bread. Morning light spread slowly across the wooden table William built himself when Victoria was 10 years old and Daniel 12. One leg had always been slightly uneven no matter how many times he tried to fix it. Margaret sat down carefully, wrapping both hands around her mug. On the mantel, in the adjoining sitting room, stood the photograph she always looked at first every morning. Daniel, 20 years gone and still the center of the house somehow. The photograph showed him at 16, standing beside the river near town, with wind pushing through his dark hair. He had William's eyes exactly, warm, honest, always seeming on the edge of laughter. Margaret sometimes felt she remembered his voice more clearly in the mornings before the world became noisy. "He'd have gone gray early," William said quietly, noticing her looking. Margaret smiled faintly. "No, he'd have denied it for years." He was vain enough. He absolutely was. Neither of them spoke for a while after that. Grief changed shape over time. In the beginning, it had been a sharp blade that cut through every hour. Later, it became heavier and quieter, like carrying stones inside your chest, something you learn to walk with. Daniel died at 16 after his car went through a barrier on a mountain road during heavy rain. The police called it tragic and unavoidable. Young driver, wet conditions, poor visibility. Margaret had repeated those words to herself for 20 years until they sounded almost holy in their familiarity. If you like this story, press like button. This helps the channel grow and to reach the stories to more people like you. The telephone rang just after 7:30. William glanced toward it, but Margaret was already standing. "Victoria," she said after seeing the caller ID. William's expression changed only slightly, so slightly another person would not have noticed, but Margaret noticed everything about him after 35 years. "Morning, darling," she answered brightly. Victoria's voice flowed warmly through the line. Gentle, attentive, perfect. "Morning, Mum. Did I wake you? You know I'm always awake early. How's Dad's shoulder?" William looked toward the ceiling slightly. Margaret smiled, still attached. Victoria laughed softly. "Tell him I asked. He heard you." "I figured." Margaret moved toward the window while speaking. Outside, the garden shimmered with dew. Victoria always called regularly, always remembered birthdays, always sent flowers on anniversaries. To anyone looking from outside, she was the devoted daughter every aging parent hoped for. But lately there had been moments, tiny moments Margaret could never fully explain afterward. Questions about paperwork asked too casually, conversations that seemed rehearsed, a certain cold pause whenever Daniel's name appeared unexpectedly. Nothing clear enough to become suspicion, just little shadows passing briefly across sunlight. "How are you feeling these days?" Victoria asked. "Really?" Margaret frowned slightly. "Fine, darling. You and Dad spend too much time alone in that house. We like our house." "I know. I just worry." There it was again. That strange tone beneath the concern. Margaret ignored it the way she always did because mothers are experts at editing discomfort out of love. "We were actually thinking," Victoria continued, "maybe the four of us could take a little trip this weekend." "The four of us?" "Me, Richard, you, Dad. Just a drive up through the mountains, fresh air, lunch somewhere nice. We haven't spent proper time together in ages." William looked over from the table. Margaret covered the receiver slightly. "She wants a family outing." William gave a small nod, but his eyes stayed thoughtful. "That sounds lovely," Margaret said. Victoria sounded relieved. "Really?" "Of course, really. I'll organize everything. You two just enjoy yourselves." After the call ended, Margaret stood quietly for a moment, holding the receiver. William buttered toast carefully. "What?" she asked. "Nothing." "That means something?" He sighed softly before sitting down. "She's trying very hard lately." "She's our daughter?" "I know." Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You worry too much." William smiled gently but not fully. "That's because one of us has to." The mountain roads curled upward like long gray ribbons through forests painted gold and amber by autumn. Margaret sat in the passenger seat beside William, while Victoria drove ahead with Richard in a separate car. The sky stretched clear and cold above them, the kind of crisp blue that only appeared in late October when the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and distant rain. Margaret rolled her window down slightly just to feel the cold against her face. "Oh, that's lovely," she whispered. Below them, valleys opened between hillsides, scattered with red and orange trees. Tiny villages rested in the distance like toy models beneath drifting clouds. Victoria had packed lunch herself, sandwiches wrapped neatly in paper, fresh fruit, thermoses of soup. She had even brought Margaret's favorite lemon biscuits from the bakery near her old school. Margaret kept noticing these gestures throughout the drive and feeling something soften inside her. Maybe this was healing? Families survived difficult seasons sometimes. People grew older, kinder, wiser. Maybe grief had finally stopped living between them. Victoria spent much of the drive talking gently from the front seat whenever they stopped beside scenic overlooks. "Careful there, Mum. Take my hand. You're cold. Here, wear my scarf. Margaret found herself moved almost to tears once or twice by the tenderness of it. She remembered Victoria at 6 years old insisting on bandaging Margaret's finger after a cooking accident, wrapping half the kitchen towel around her hand with fierce concentration. Children changed, but surely somewhere underneath adulthood they remained themselves. Richard stayed quieter. He smiled often enough, but his eyes rarely joined in. Tall and neatly dressed even for a mountain drive, he carried himself with the polished confidence of a man who liked controlling rooms without speaking much. William barely spoke at all. At one stop, Margaret touched his arm. "You all right?" "Fine." "You've been quiet all morning?" "Just tired." But his gaze kept drifting toward Victoria when she was not looking. Watchful, measuring. The road narrowed higher up the mountain. Pine trees replaced autumn colors gradually, their dark branches swaying against the wind. By afternoon, the air had grown sharply colder. Victoria suggested one final stop before lunch. "There's an overlook just ahead," she said brightly. "The view is incredible." Margaret could hear the excitement in her voice and smiled. The overlook rested beyond a gravel path, edged with wild grass and stone markers worn smooth by decades of weather. Wind rushed steadily across the cliffside, carrying the scent of pine and distant water. Margaret stepped out slowly, one hand pressed against her lower back. "Oh my goodness," she breathed. The valley stretched endlessly below them. A silver river wound between villages and forests far beneath the mountain. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin drifting lines. Tiny roads curved through fields touched gold by afternoon sunlight. Everything looked peaceful from that height, quiet enough to belong to another world entirely. William stood beside her, one hand lightly against her elbow. "Beautiful," Margaret whispered. Victoria approached from behind, holding her phone. "Stand closer together," she said. "I want a picture." Margaret laughed softly. "At our age? At your age especially?" William gave the faintest smile. They stood near the railing while Victoria took photographs. Wind pushed Margaret's hair across her face. "Daniel would have loved this view," Margaret said suddenly. The words slipped out naturally. Silence followed. Brief, thin, strange. Margaret turned slightly. Victoria's expression had changed. Not dramatically, not enough for certainty, but something inside it had gone flat, empty almost. "Darling?" Margaret asked quietly. Victoria stepped closer. "Mother," she said softly, "you never asked the right questions." Margaret frowned, confused. "What questions, darling?" Victoria looked directly into her eyes and pushed her. There are moments when life breaks so suddenly the mind cannot keep pace with the body. Margaret did not understand at first. One second stone rested beneath her shoes. The next there was nothing. The world tilted violently. Sky, wind, the scream trapped somewhere inside her chest. She saw William lunging toward her, his face transformed by horror. Then his body disappeared over the edge beside hers. Everything became slow, painfully slow. Branches clawed against her coat as she tumbled downward. Rock struck her shoulder. Air vanished from her lungs. The mountains spun endlessly around her in flashes of gray stone and dark trees. Some distant part of her mind kept insisting this was impossible. Victoria, not Victoria. Not her little girl with scraped knees and missing front teeth and birthday candles reflected in bright young eyes. Margaret hit something hard enough to burst white light across her vision, then rolled again. More impact, more silence. At last her body stopped against cold earth and broken brush, somewhere far below the overlook. For several seconds she could not breathe at all. The world rang around her, Somewhere nearby, William groaned. Margaret tried to move, but agony exploded through her ribs and hip. A wet metallic taste filled her mouth. Above them, the mountains stood silent. Wind moved through trees overhead with soft whispering sounds. Margaret stared upward at a narrow strip of sky between branches, while pain spread slowly through every part of her body. Then William's voice came beside her, barely audible. "Don't move." She turned her head slightly toward him. Blood darkened one side of his forehead. "William, don't make a sound," he whispered urgently. "She might come back to check." Margaret froze. The words entered her slowly. Terribly. Not accident. Not misunderstanding. Not confusion. Their daughter had just tried to kill them. Margaret lay motionless among broken branches while pain pulsed through her body in heavy waves. Every breath scraped against her ribs like shattered glass. The cold earth beneath her smelled of wet leaves and pine sap. Somewhere close by, water trickled over rocks with terrible, ordinary calm. Beside her, William's hands searched blindly through the darkness until his fingers found hers. She gripped him immediately. Above them, the sky had begun fading toward evening. Margaret could hear footsteps near the edge of the overlook high above. Small stones shifted loose and tumbled downward through trees. "Victoria!" Margaret stopped breathing entirely. Her daughter's voice drifted down through the cold air. "It's done." So calm, so empty. Another voice answered. "Richard, are you certain?" "Yes." Margaret closed her eyes. Then Victoria said the words that split the world apart forever, just like the first time. Silence followed. Not outside, inside her. The first time, Daniel. Margaret's body suddenly felt weightless despite the pain crushing through it. Memories burst open violently inside her mind. Daniel laughing while fixing an old bicycle in the garage. Daniel standing beside Victoria at the kitchen sink, splashing dishwater at her while she screamed dramatically. Daniel leaving the house the final night alive. Victoria watching him from the hallway. Had she known then? Had she already decided? Margaret wanted to scream until the mountain cracked open beneath them. But fear held her still. Above, Richard spoke again. "No one saw us." "No. And the Wills? They're still unchanged." Footsteps moved away gradually. Branches rustled. Then nothing. Margaret stared upward through tears she could not even feel. William squeezed her hand weakly. "I know," he whispered. The darkness deepened slowly around them. Time lost shape. Margaret drifted in and out of awareness while pain settled heavier through her body. Once she thought she heard Daniel calling for her somewhere far away. Once she imagined she was back in her classroom reading poetry aloud while rain tapped softly against windows. Then barking shattered the silence. Sharp, urgent, close. A dog pushed through brush nearby, barking wildly. Margaret heard an older man's voice somewhere uphill. "Easy now. What is it?" Lantern light flickered between trees. The dog barked harder. Branches cracked under approaching footsteps. Then an old man appeared through the darkness, carrying a lantern high before him. His lined face froze in shock when the light reached them. "Sweet Lord." Margaret tried speaking, but only a broken sound escaped. The old man knelt immediately. "Don't move," he said gently. "You're badly hurt." The lantern trembled slightly in his hand as he looked between them. "My name's Samuel. Can you hear me?" William nodded faintly. Samuel removed his coat and covered Margaret carefully despite her protests. "You're freezing." The dog circled anxiously nearby, whining into the darkness. Samuel moved with surprising steadiness for his age. He checked William first, then Margaret, speaking softly the entire time, as though afraid silence itself might harm them further. "I've got you now." Margaret would remember those words for the rest of her life. She heard sirens much later. Voices, flashlights cutting through trees, hands lifting her carefully onto a stretcher while pain exploded white behind her eyes. Everything blurred after that. Cold night air, the smell of gasoline, someone asking her name repeatedly, William somewhere nearby calling weakly for her. Then ambulance lights flashing red against darkness while the world slowly dissolved into white. Margaret woke to the smell of antiseptic and the steady mechanical rhythm of hospital machines. For several moments, she did not know where she was. Then pain returned, heavy, deep, everywhere. Her eyes opened slowly. William sat beside the bed watching her. Relief crossed his face so intensely it nearly broke her heart. Neither spoke immediately. They simply looked at each other while the quiet hospital room hummed softly around them. Everything understood. Everything changed forever. Margaret noticed the bruising along William's jaw, the bandages around his hands, one arm resting stiffly in a sling. "You're alive," she whispered. "So are you." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Daniel," the memory hit her again with fresh violence. William leaned closer carefully. "We wait," he said quietly. She nodded once. The door opened mid-morning. Victoria entered already crying. Margaret watched her daughter through half-open eyes. The performance would have been convincing to anyone else. Victoria's hands trembled. Her face looked pale and exhausted. Tears ran perfectly down her cheeks as she hurried toward the bed. "Oh God, Mum." She kissed Margaret's forehead gently. Margaret felt nothing. Not anger yet, not hatred, just a terrible emptiness. "You scared us so badly," Victoria whispered. "The path was slippery, and then suddenly you both just..." Her voice broke dramatically. Margaret stared at the ceiling. William remained silent beside her. Richard arrived moments later, carrying flowers no one touched. Police came that afternoon. A young officer with tired eyes and careful manners stood near the foot of Margaret's bed, holding a small notebook. "We just need to understand what happened," he said gently. Victoria sat nearby, wrapped in a blanket, despite the warmth of the room, perfectly fragile. "It happened so fast," she whispered before Margaret could speak. "The path was wet. They were standing near the edge, and suddenly they lost their footing. I tried to grab them." Margaret turned her head slightly toward the officer. He waited patiently. "Mrs. Hale?" he asked softly. William's fingers brushed against her hand beneath the blanket. 2 squeezes. Their signal from years ago. "Wait." Margaret swallowed carefully. "I cannot remember clearly." Victoria visibly relaxed. The officer nodded sympathetically. "Trauma can affect memory." William spoke next. "Neither can I yet." The officer took notes quietly before leaving. Victoria remained another hour beside the bed, speaking gently about medications and doctors and how lucky they were to survive. Margaret watched her daughter closely now. Every expression, every pause, every carefully placed word. And beneath it all, she finally saw what had always existed unnoticed. Distance, coldness, calculation. Not new, simply hidden. That night, rain tapped softly against the hospital windows while machines beeped steadily in the darkness. Victoria and Richard had gone home. The room glowed dim blue beneath hallway light. Margaret lay awake, staring toward the ceiling. William spoke first. "She said exactly what you heard?" "Yes, just like the first time." Margaret's throat tightened painfully. William looked older suddenly. Smaller somehow. "I've replayed Daniel's accident every day for 20 years, he whispered. "Every single day wondering if I should have stopped him from driving that night." Margaret turned toward him slowly despite the pain. "We trusted her." "I know. She was our child." William rubbed one hand over his face. "I remember that night now differently." Margaret listened. Victoria kept asking Daniel where he was going, what route he planned taking. At the time, it seemed normal. Margaret remembered too. Richard had started dating Victoria only months earlier then. Young, charming, too charming perhaps. Daniel disliked him immediately, not openly. Daniel rarely spoke badly about people, but Margaret remembered tension between them during dinners. Tiny moments. Daniel once saying quietly, "There's something wrong with that man." Margaret had scolded him for judging too quickly. Now nausea rolled through her. "We missed it," she whispered. William shook his head slowly. "No, they hid it." Margaret began crying silently then. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears slipping sideways into her hair while 20 years of certainty collapsed inside her. William reached carefully across the narrow space between beds and held her hand. "We have one chance," he said quietly. "One chance to do this right." Margaret stared into darkness for a long time before answering. For Daniel, they returned home 3 weeks later, beneath gray November skies. Victoria greeted them with casseroles and fresh flowers and soft concern. Margaret almost admired the discipline required to maintain the performance so completely. Almost. The house felt unchanged at first glance. Same ticking clock in the hallway, same smell of old books and cedar wood, same garden birds fluttering around the feeder outside the kitchen window. But truth alters rooms even when nothing physical changes. Margaret saw ghosts everywhere now, not supernatural ones. Memories reconsidered. Victoria hugging Daniel too tightly the week before he died. Richard asking casual questions about insurance policies during early family dinners. The way Victoria never cried at Daniel's funeral until other people approached her. Margaret had once explained all these things away because love naturally seeks innocence in those it protects. Not anymore. They moved carefully, quietly, methodically. William repaired loose hinges and stacked firewood exactly as usual, while secretly recording every interaction with Victoria using an old audio device hidden inside his coat pocket. Margaret played the role expected of her beautifully. Fragile mother, traumatized survivor, forgetful woman, overwhelmed by grief and medication. Victoria relaxed more every week because she believed fear had made them weak. It never occurred to her that grief could sharpen people instead. Margaret began with Daniel's old friends. Most had scattered over the years, families, jobs, different towns. One finally agreed to meet. His name was Peter Lawson. Margaret remembered him as a nervous boy who always apologized too much and laughed too loudly at Daniel's jokes. Now he sat across from her in a quiet cafe, twisting his coffee cup endlessly between both hands. His hair had gone gray early. "I should have come years ago," he said softly. Margaret waited. Outside, rain slid slowly down windows while evening traffic passed beyond blurred glass. Peter stared at the table. The night Daniel died, he wasn't supposed to drive alone. Margaret's pulse quickened painfully. "He called me first. Wanted company. Said he needed air after arguing with Victoria and Richard." What argument? Peter swallowed hard. Money. Margaret felt cold despite the cafe warmth. Richard had debts already back then. Gambling mostly. Daniel found out somehow. Peter rubbed trembling hands together. "He told me Victoria was asking questions about your wills, about the house. Daniel thought Richard was manipulating her." Margaret could barely breathe. "What happened that night?" Peter closed his eyes briefly. "I saw Richard's truck near the Upper Mountain Road maybe 20 minutes before the accident." Margaret leaned forward slowly. "You're certain?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell police?" Peter looked ashamed. "Richard came to see me 2 days later." The words dropped heavily between them. "He said grief makes people imagine things. Said I could destroy your family with rumors. I was 20, scared. I convinced myself maybe I'd mistaken the truck. Margaret sat silently for a long time. Then she asked the question quietly. Did Daniel know he was in danger? Peter's eyes filled immediately. No, God no. He trusted her. Margaret returned home after dark. William listened without interrupting while she repeated every word beside the kitchen table. When she finished, he stood silently and walked to the mantel. Daniel's photograph rested there, smiling forever at 16. William touched the frame gently. I failed him, he whispered. Margaret crossed the room immediately, despite aching ribs. No, I should have protected him. You didn't know, but I should have. Margaret took his face carefully between both hands. Listen to me. Evil hidden inside your own child is not something a father expects to find. William closed his eyes. The investigation reopened officially 2 weeks later. Detective Claire Mercer arrived on a cold Monday morning, carrying 3 thick folders and an expression Margaret trusted immediately because it lacked performance. Young, focused, careful. She listened more than she spoke. That mountain road accident from 20 years ago bothered me after reviewing the file, she admitted. Some details never aligned properly. Margaret and William exchanged glances. What details? William asked. The brake line damage? Margaret felt dizzy. The original report claimed impact caused it, but modern review suggests otherwise. Cut? William whispered. Detective Mercer nodded once. Silence filled the room heavily. Margaret gripped her teacup tightly enough her hands shook. The following months unfolded like slow, careful stitching. Financial investigators uncovered enormous debts hidden beneath Victoria and Richard's polished life. Credit cards, loans, second mortgages. Insurance policies updated quietly after Daniel's death and again after Margaret and William's retirement. Victoria had recently pushed repeatedly for them to revise their will to simplify future stress. Margaret remembered laughing during those conversations. You're too young to worry about inheritance, darling. Victoria had smiled back. You never know, Mum. Now every memory sounded different. Detective Mercer visited often. Each time she brought another small piece. Phone records placing Richard near the mountain the night Daniel died. Search histories regarding inheritance law. Deleted messages recovered between Victoria and Richard discussing timing. Still, Margaret and William continued Sunday dinners faithfully. Victoria cooked roast chicken. Richard poured wine. Everyone smiled. Margaret sometimes thought the performance itself exhausted her more than the injuries still healing inside her body. One Sunday, Victoria touched Margaret's arm gently across the table. You seem stronger lately. Margaret smiled softly. Your father keeps me moving. Richard watched them both carefully over his glass. Margaret noticed everything now. The quick look passing between husband and wife whenever legal matters surfaced casually in conversation. The tension in Richard's jaw whenever William mentioned meeting with accountants. Fear growing slowly beneath confidence. After dinner, Victoria hugged Margaret tightly at the doorway. I'm so grateful you survived, she whispered. Margaret almost broke then. Not because she believed her, because part of her still remembered the child she used to carry sleeping from car to bed after long evenings visiting grandparents. Love does not disappear neatly even after betrayal. That is the cruel part. One snowy afternoon, Detective Mercer arrived carrying an evidence box. We found this hidden inside Richard's old workshop storage unit. Inside rested tools, receipts, and Daniel's watch. Margaret stopped breathing. The small silver watch William gave Daniel for his 16th birthday lay, scratched but unmistakable beneath clear evidence plastic. It disappeared after the accident, William said hoarsely. Detective Mercer nodded. Richard kept it. Margaret touched the plastic gently with trembling fingers. Daniel had worn that watch every day, despite constantly forgetting to wind it. She suddenly remembered teasing him about it while packing school lunches. The memory hurt so sharply she had to sit down. We're close now, Detective Mercer said quietly. Margaret looked up. Close to what? The detective's expression hardened slightly. Confession? The call came on a Tuesday morning while rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Margaret sat in her usual chair, holding untouched tea between both hands, when the telephone rang. William looked up immediately from the newspaper. Margaret answered. Mrs. Hale? Detective Mercer's voice sounded calm but tight with controlled energy. We brought Victoria and Richard in for questioning early this morning. Margaret felt suddenly cold. Neither she nor William spoke. The detective continued carefully. Richard requested separate counsel after 2 hours. William stood slowly behind Margaret's chair. What happened? He asked quietly. There was a pause. Then Detective Mercer said the words Margaret had imagined and feared simultaneously for months. He confessed. Margaret stared at the garden beyond the window. Rain blurred everything outside into soft gray shapes. William's hands settled gently on her shoulders. He implicated Victoria in both incidents. Detective Mercer continued. After being confronted separately, she confessed as well. Margaret did not move. Inside, the kitchen clock ticked steadily. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked as the house settled. The ordinary sounds of life continued while her world changed permanently again. What did she say? Margaret whispered at last. Detective Mercer exhaled softly. She described years of financial pressure. Richard accumulated large gambling debts. They believed inheritance would solve everything. Margaret closed her eyes. She said resentment built slowly over time. She felt Daniel threatened her future because he remained closer to you both emotionally. She feared he would inherit the house eventually. William's grip tightened slightly against her shoulders. Margaret could barely hear now through the rushing sound inside her ears. The mountain incident 20 years ago was planned quickly, the detective said gently. Richard tampered with Daniel's brakes while Victoria distracted him inside the cafe where they stopped earlier that evening. Margaret's chest hurt sharply. She admitted the recent attempt happened because your updated retirement accounts increased substantially after William sold part of his business investments last year. Silence. Then Margaret asked the only question that truly mattered. Did Daniel know what was coming? The line stayed quiet several seconds. No, Detective Mercer answered softly. According to Richard, the brake failure happened suddenly. Daniel would not have anticipated it. The impact was immediate. Margaret nodded once, though no one could see. One tear slid slowly down her cheek. Only one. William bent and pressed his forehead gently against her hair. Margaret whispered into the silence, "Thank you." After the call ended, neither spoke for a long while. Rain continued outside. Finally, William pulled out the chair beside her and sat down heavily. "She was our daughter," he said quietly. Margaret stared at her cooling tea. "Yes, I keep trying to understand how someone becomes capable of that." "You won't." William looked at her tiredly. "How are you so certain?" "Because people like us search for reasons inside ourselves first." Margaret's voice remained calm somehow, but some emptiness belongs entirely to the person carrying it. William covered his eyes briefly with one hand. Margaret reached across the table and held his wrist gently. "We loved her," she said. "That part was real." William lowered his hand slowly. "Was it enough?" Margaret thought about Daniel then. About scraped knees, birthday cakes, late-night fevers, Christmas mornings, thousands upon thousands of ordinary acts of devotion stretching across decades. "Yes," she whispered, "it was enough for us." Months passed. Winter softened gradually into spring. Margaret spent mornings again in the garden beneath pale sunlight, while birds hopped through flower beds William rebuilt after the snow thawed. Her body healed slower than doctors predicted. Some injuries never fully disappeared. Cold mornings still stiffened her hip. Long walks left her ribs aching faintly. But she remained alive. Some days that felt miraculous. Daniel's photograph now rested on the garden table beside her tea each morning. She spoke to him sometimes quietly while trimming lavender or watering herbs, not because she believed he answered, because motherhood never really ends even after death. William spent longer hours inside his workshop behind the house. The steady sound of hammering returned gradually, comforting his heartbeat. Always building, always repairing. Margaret realized one afternoon that this had always been William's answer to pain. When Daniel died, he built bookshelves. After funerals, he repaired fences. During difficult winters, he made tables no one requested. Creation against destruction. A stubborn refusal to let broken things remain broken. The house felt different now. Not emptier, more honest. Silence no longer hid danger inside it. Margaret returned to teaching in early April. Only one afternoon class twice weekly at the Adult Learning Center nearby, literature for older students who wanted stories more than certificates. The classroom smelled faintly of dust and coffee and old paper, exactly the way classrooms should. Margaret stood before her students during the first session feeling unexpectedly nervous, until one woman in the front row smiled warmly and everything settled again. Words still belonged to her. One rainy afternoon, while discussing poetry, Margaret paused beside the window, listening briefly to weather tapping against glass. "Words have weight," she told her students softly. "Use them carefully." The room stayed quiet. "And listen," she continued, "really listen to what is not being said." Several students nodded thoughtfully while making notes. Margaret never mentioned Victoria by name. She never would. Some griefs become too private for language. One evening near the beginning of summer, Margaret sat alone in the garden while sunset turned the sky pale gold above the trees. Warm wind carried the smell of roses and cut grass through the quiet yard. Daniel's photograph rested in her lap. She studied it carefully. The familiar smile, the wind-blown hair, the eyes. For 20 years, she had looked at that photograph, searching for what she lost. Now suddenly she saw something else. William's eyes, not simply the same color, the same kindness, the same steadiness. She laughed softly through tears at the realization. "How did I never notice?" she whispered. William appeared quietly from the workshop, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He sat beside her without asking questions. Margaret handed him the photograph. William looked down at it for a long moment. Then he smiled sadly. He did, didn't he? Yes. The evening settled gently around them. Birdsong faded gradually into dusk. Margaret leaned her head against William's shoulder while he held the photograph between both hands carefully, almost reverently. At their age, they understood something younger people often missed. Love was not proven through grand declarations. It lived inside survival, inside staying, inside choosing tenderness after life handed you every reason to become hard. Margaret looked toward the darkening garden and thought about mountains and hospitals and police stations and gravesides and classrooms and kitchens and every ordinary moment threaded between them. Then finally she understood something grief had been trying to teach her for years. The cruelest losses are not always the ones that happen suddenly on a mountain edge. Sometimes the cruelest loss is the slow, quiet realization of what you never saw in the people standing right beside you. But here is what I know now, what I carry like a lantern in the dark. Love given freely is never wasted, not even when it is not deserved. because it was never really about them. It was always about who you chose to be. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone you love today, and perhaps hold them a little closer.